The Fall Guy sold America a fantasy about stuntmen chasing fugitives. One of its stars ended up firing a real gun at a real intruder inside her own bedroom. Two of the people you are about to meet are gone. Here is what happened to all of them. Number 1. Lee Majors, the man who played Colt S. Evers, was an orphan before he turned 2. His father, Carl Year E., died 5 months before the boy was born. Alice, his mother, was killed by a drunk driver when he was roughly 17 months old. An uncle and aunt, Harvey and Mildred Year E., adopted him at 2 and raised him in Middlesboro, Kentucky. Everything that came afterward, including a career spent being thrown through windshields for money, was built on top of that beginning. Football was meant to be the escape route. He played at Indiana University, transferred to Eastern Kentucky, and then injured his back so badly that the athletic career ended before it could properly start. A degree in history and physical education followed in 1962, along with work as a recreation director at North Hollywood Park and acting classes in the evenings under Dick Clayton and Estelle Harmon. The name on his birth certificate was Harvey Lee Year E. The name he chose for himself was a nod to a football player called Johnny Majors. Then came Heath Bark Lee on the Big Valley and Colonel Steve Austin on the $6 Million Man. And by the time Glen Larson offered him a truck and a stack of bail bonds in 1981, he was 42 and the most recognizable action face on American television. Colt Severs was the calmest man in prime time. Majors played him with a low, unhurried drawl and a permanent half-smile, a stuntman who could be blown off a roof and come up brushing his sleeve. He performed the great majority of the stunts himself, and the figures he has given over the years run from 85 to 95%. The theme song is him singing too, and the end credits handed that vocal to Colt S. Evers rather than to Lee Majors, which was the show winking at itself. Here is the part of his life that never made it into an episode. In 1977, while The $6 Million Man was still a hit, he tried to renegotiate with Universal Television. The studio sued him. It went to court to force him back onto its own soundstage under a contract that had not yet expired, and the fight, by his manager's account, was never really about the money. Majors wanted his own company, FAW Set Majors Productions, brought in as a producing partner. He did not report to work that June. The studio eventually gave way and he came back with a raise, but the ratings had slipped, and ABC canceled the series in March of 1978. A man famous for playing a government asset had been dragged into a courtroom by the corporation that owned him. He went back years later, from the other side of the table. In 2003, he sued Universal Television Group for breach of contract and fraud over the 15% of net profits he said he was owed, demanded a full audit of the books, and then dropped the case in 2005. The marriages ran alongside all of it. Kathy Robinson, from 1961 to 1964, gave him his son, Lee Majors II. Farrah Fawcett married him in 1973 and separated from him in 1979, and the divorce was finalized in 1982, the exact year The Fall Guy found its audience. Karen Vu Les followed, from 1988 to 1994. Faith Noel Cross married him on the 1st of November 2002, and she is with him still. He is 87 years old. His birthday came in April. He lives in California, and in January of this year he walked into a comic convention in central North Carolina and reunited with Lindsay Wagner in front of a room full of people who grew up on the pair of them. His knees are the receipt for all of it. He has talked openly about cartilage worn down by college football and by 2 decades of taking his own falls, and about a knee replacement he was moving toward. Colt Severs caught fugitives who could not outrun a stuntman. Lee Majors outran everything except the corporation that hired him and the joints he broke doing the work himself. Number 2 on this roster is the reason the opening of this video is not an exaggeration. Heather Thomas played Jody Banks, the stunt woman in the passenger seat, for all 5 seasons. She was 24 when the show premiered and 28 when it ended, and the network used her as a poster. What almost nobody watching understood was that the young woman on those posters held a film degree from UCLA and had wanted to write and direct, never to perform. Her parents were educators. Leon Thomas was a university dean, and Gladys Ryder taught special education in the Santa Monica and Malibu school district. At 14, their daughter was picked as one of the hosts of an NBC series called Talking with a Giant, where a teenager sat across from public figures and interviewed them. She graduated from Santa Monica High School in 1975 and from film school in 1980, and then the industry saw a face and stopped listening to anything else. During the run of The Fall Guy, she developed a cocaine addiction, and she went into rehabilitation in the middle of that decade. She has discussed it herself, which is the only reason it belongs here. In August of 1985, she married Alan Rose Untal, one of the founders of the 12-step organization Cocaine Anonymous. They divorced 13 months later. That very same month, September of 1986, she was crossing San Vicente Boulevard when a car hit her. Both legs were seriously injured. Doctors initially discussed the possibility of a double amputation. Surgeries came, and a long hospital stay came after those. And the woman who had spent 5 years pretending to survive car stunts was very nearly destroyed by an ordinary walk across a street. None of that is why she left Hollywood. In March of last year, on a podcast called Still Here Hollywood, Thomas finally described the years she had kept quiet about. At the worst of it, she was dealing with roughly 2 stalkers a week. She had, in her own words, tons of restraining orders. A live-in bodyguard stayed at the house. A box of bullets arrived in the post. Somebody stole funeral wreaths from a graveyard and sent those as well. One man climbed her gate holding a large buck knife while 2 little girls were inside. And then a man cut through the screen of her bedroom window and climbed in, and Heather Thomas shot him. Her gun was loaded with rock salt and birdshot rather than a live round, which is the detail that tells you she had thought this through and had decided she was not going to kill anybody inside her own house. She has said she does not know whether the man was ever charged. Stalking laws barely existed then. By the middle of the 1990s, she was gone from the business, and she has been clear that her daughters, not her career, made that decision for her. Writing was what she turned to instead. A screenplay went to Touchstone Pictures, and a novel called Trophies was published in 2008. She sits on the boards of the Rape Foundation and the Amazon Conservation Team. In October of 1992, she married the entertainment lawyer Skip Britton-Ham, co-founder of ZIF Ren Britton-Ham and the man who helped build Pixar's first Disney deal. Their daughter India Rose was born in June of 2000, when Thomas was 42. Britton-Ham died on the 17th of July 2025 at the age of 83. She is 68 now, and she has been a widow for 13 months. Jodi Banks never once had to protect herself when the cameras stopped rolling. Heather Thomas fired a real weapon at a real stranger in her own bedroom, and then spent the next 30 years making sure the version of her that the industry had sold could not find her again. If you remember Jodi Banks as nothing more than a poster on somebody's wall, tell me in the comments what you make of her now. I genuinely want to know whether that story changed the show for you. The next name on this list was working both ends of the criminal justice system at the same time, on 2 rival networks, and almost nobody noticed. Number 3. Marquee Post arrived in 1982 as Terry Shannon, a bail bondswoman later renamed Terry Michaels, and she stayed for 64 episodes across 3 seasons. Terry was the one who handed out the assignments and refused to be impressed by any of them. Post played her fast and dry and permanently slightly exasperated, a professional woman surrounded by men who kept destroying her trucks, and she made the paperwork feel like a plot. She was born Marjorie Armstrong Post on the 4th of November 1950 in Palo Alto, California, to a physicist father and a poet mother. Before she ever acted, she worked in game show production, behind the scenes on Split Second, Double Dare and Card Sharks, handling other people's questions and other people's prizes. The Fall Guy, at 31, was the first job that ever put her name in a cast list as a regular. Here is the collision. While she was still bonding fugitives out of jail on ABC, she took the part of Christine Sullivan on Night Court over at NBC, replacing Ellen Foley. For roughly a year, Marquee Post was playing a bail bondswoman who put defendants back on the street and a public defender who argued for those same defendants in front of a judge in the same week for competing networks. One woman, both ends of the identical pipeline. She left The Fall Guy after the 4th season and stayed in that courtroom for 159 episodes. The marriage outlasted both shows. She married the writer Michael A. Ross in 1982, the same year she joined The Fall Guy, and they were still married 39 years later when she died. 2 daughters came out of it, the actress Kate Armstrong Ross and Daisy Shaneborn, and there was a granddaughter by the end. Then she got sick, and she did not tell the public. Cancer had taken hold roughly 3 years and 10 months before the end, and she kept working through most of it, and the specific type has never been released by her family. On the 7th of August, 2021, Markie Post died at her home in Los Angeles at the age of 70. Her manager confirmed it to reporters late that Saturday night. She was cremated, her ashes were given to her family, and there is no cemetery to visit. What her family chose to say afterward had nothing to do with television. Their pride, they said, was in the person who made elaborate cakes for friends, sewed curtains for first apartments, and showed them how to be kind and loving and forgiving in a harsh world. Terry Michaels spent 3 seasons deciding which fugitive was worth the money. Markie Post spent 39 years in one marriage, hid a 4-year illness from an entire country, and was mourned for her curtains. Number 4 is the one who got out. Douglas Barr played Howie Munson in 112 of the show's 113 episodes, which is more than anybody except Lee Majors. Howie was the man who did not want to be there, and that reluctance was the engine of the entire series. Barr played him as an accountant who was permanently 1 second away from a car crash, flapping and objecting, and then climbing into the truck anyway. His background does not fit the part at all. Born in Cedar Rapids, Iowa in 1949, he started at the University of Northern Colorado and then transferred to George Washington University in the capital because he wanted to be nearer what was happening. He arrived in time for the Vietnam War protests at their peak, and he graduated in 1972 with a degree in philosophy. Modeling came next, in New York and in London, and by his own account, he fell into that by accident. On one of those jobs, he met a fellow model named Claire Ann Kirk Connell. They married in June of 1984, during the 4th season of The Fall Guy. 42 years later, they are still married, and Barr has kept whatever else there is of his private life entirely out of view, which for a man who was in American living rooms every week is its own quiet achievement. He has spoken warmly about the show. Lee Majors, he has said, was both a mentor and a friend, the one who taught him the unwritten rules of a working set. Those years gave him the real stunts, the real injuries, and the near misses, and they gave him friendships with Majors and with Heather Thomas that have now lasted 4 decades. Then, he did the thing almost nobody in that business manages. He moved behind the camera and stayed there, directing more than 30 films from the middle of the 1990s onward, most of them television movies, including a long run of work for the Hallmark Channel. And in 1998, he and his wife bought into the Napa Valley and founded a small, high-end winery called Hollywood and Vine Cellars, in partnership with his old college roommate Bruce O.H. Roche. Today he is 77, retired from filmmaking and retired from winemaking, and he sits on the board of a small Napa Valley nonprofit called the St. Helena Forum, which exists to support creativity in the town where he lives. He gave a long 2-part podcast interview at the end of last year and sounded like a man with nothing left to prove to anyone. Howie Munson spent 5 years being dragged into other people's trouble and complaining the whole way through it. Douglas Barr walked away from the cameras, planted a hillside, and is the only person on this list who chose every single one of his exits himself. If you are enjoying this, subscribe before you go, because there are more of these coming. It costs nothing and it keeps these people remembered. Number 5 vanished between seasons, and in 44 years nobody has ever explained why. Joanne Flugg played Samantha Jack, known to everybody as Big Jack, the very first of Colt C. vs. Bail Bondswomen. She was there for the whole of the first season, 1981 into 1982, and she built the template the series then reused for another 4 years. Big Jack held the money, named the bounty, and did not flinch, and Flugg gave her the unhurried authority of somebody who had spent a lot of her life as the only woman in the room. She had been exactly that. Raised in Winter Park, Florida, where her father was elected mayor in 1958, she took a broadcasting degree at the University of Miami and hosted a radio program there called The Magic Carpet, then a weekly interview show of her own. By the late 1960s, she had become the first woman in Los Angeles to host a live weekly television talk show on KHJ Channel 9. Her breakthrough on film came in 1970 as Lieutenant Maria Schneider, the nurse everybody called Dish, in Robert Altman's MASH. From 1973 to 1981, she was a fixture on the Match Game panel, and she co-hosted Candid Camera alongside Alan Funt. Then, a hit series put her in the opening titles, and after one season she was simply not there. No firing was announced. Nobody explained the departure. Every retrospective written since has said the same thing, which is that no definitive public reason has ever been given. A woman who had been on American screens for 15 years lost a network job, and the industry did not bother to say a word about it. Her marriage had ended the year before the show even began. She married the game show host Chuck Wool A. Ree in 1972, and after 9 years they divorced in 1980. Their daughter Melissa was 6 when the coverage of the split ran. Both parents had become born-again Christians through their friend Pat Boone, and by the account published at the time, they worked hard to keep the whole thing civil for the child's sake. In May of 1988, she married Charles Stuck Young. Florida took her home again. She kept taking film roles into the 1990s, including Traveler and Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, both released in 1997, and then she retired from acting that same year. Since then, she has built training programs on etiquette for children and for business people, and she tours as a motivational speaker. In 2011, she went back on the radio in Florida with a show of her own, interviewing performers, which is precisely the job she had first picked up at university more than 40 years earlier. Joanne Flugg is 86. Big Jack decided which criminal was worth chasing. Joanne Flugg was written out of that job without a single public sentence of explanation, and she answered by going back to the microphone she had picked up long before Hollywood ever called. Number 6 was already famous in a canvas tent before commercial radio existed. Nee Drew Volz turned up in the final stretch of The Fall Guy as Pearl Sperling across a handful of episodes in 1985 and 1986. She was 76 and then 77 while she was doing it. And the joke was the contrast, a tiny elderly woman parked in the middle of a series built on explosions and refusing to be impressed by any of it. Volz had a gift for making an old lady look like the most dangerous person in the room. Her real story is the one nobody else on that set could match. Born Nedru Viola Gordo-Neer on the 18th of June, 1908, in Montrose, Iowa, she was the child of vaudeville performers, and she was working in the family tent show as a toddler under the billing baby Nedru. In the early 1930s, she was the featured vocalist with a band called K-Toes Vagabonds. By 1932, she was singing on the radio in Rochester, New York, as part of an act billed as Annie Dra, Paul and Glen. And then, Hollywood ignored her for 40 years. Her first film credit came in 1973 when she was 65 years old. Television did not find her until 1975 on an episode of Good Times when she was 67. A performer who had been standing in front of paying audiences since she could walk was not put on a screen until she was old enough to draw a pension, and then she worked constantly as Adelaide Brubaker on Different Strokes, as Emma Tisdale on The Dukes of Hazzard, and in films including Lust in the Dust and Earth Girls Are Easy. Orrin William Volz married her in 1944 when she was 36. That marriage lasted 43 years, until his death in 1987, and it produced 3 children, Edward, Linda, and Barbara Lee. Her last film role came in 1996. In the late 1990s, she left California and moved to Arizona to be closer to those children. Nedru Volz died in Mesa, Arizona, on the 20th of January 2003 at the age of 94 from complications of Alzheimer's disease. She was cremated, and like Marquis Post, she left behind no headstone for anybody to find. Her working life as a performer had run for something close to 90 years, from a canvas tent in Iowa to a network action series in Los Angeles. Pearl Sperling was a bit part in a show about men who chased criminals for a living. Nedru Volz was the only person in this entire cast whose life contains no collision with the law at all, and she outlived very nearly everybody who ever underestimated her. 5 seasons, 113 episodes, 1 truck. 4 of them are still here. Two of them left no grave to visit.